Welcome to another Univirtual Experience. This is a collaborative partnership conference and festival with the Virtual World Society and Educators in VR. And we're bringing together the experts and the innovators in immersive education to really talk about how we're disrupting education around the world. And you are at an event that is about that
Oops.
Oops.
Lost your audio.
You cut
Laurel.
out, Laurel.
She'll be back. She cut out.
Yep. Laurel will probably be back. Could be update. We'll just give her a moment.
Did I say disruption? I said the word disruption, didn't I?
I think you did.
One of the disruptions I have is I have very bad internet, and it's insane. All right, so we're talking about disruption, and this event is a discussion on with the top leaders. We could not get better. Thank you, Caitlin and Virtual World Society, bringing these people together to talk about the ethical considerations that are at play when it comes to making these fantasy and real and educational worlds and everything associated with it. This would not be possible. The Univirtual Experience that is 30 days on over 19 different platforms and apps. Never been done before like this. We're breaking all the rules again. This would not be possible if it wasn't for our amazing sponsors. So our Infinity sponsors, HP Virtual Reality and HP Higher Education. Thank you, thank you, thank you. They just released a new edition of the HP Reverb G2 that's designed for higher ed and for research with pulse and eye monitoring and testing and some amazing innovations in it. So do check that out. Check out our articles at educatorsinvr.com about that, and head over to hp.com, virtual reality, and HP Higher Ed to find out more information. Want to thank also our Galaxy sponsors, Engage VR and Advantage Education, also changing education in VR and XR. Also want to thank Donna McTaggart of Let's Meet in VR, the events manager and director for Educators in VR and the Univirtual Experience, and Tony Studios for the generosity and spirit in assisting with the video and live streaming, as well as all of our amazing volunteers. And this, it takes an army, not just a village, it takes an army to make this happen. So thank you. Now, I want to introduce to you this incredible panel of that have come together here. Thank you again for Virtual World Society and Caitlin for pulling these people together, and for each of you for stepping up. So we're really exploring what does virtual reality, what effects it has on the creators, the users, and society at large. What is it, the impact on manufacturing, all the way to events, user access, the experiences, all of these things. What are the ethical considerations? What are the legal, prescriptive, and restrictive measures that are necessary? And what are the general codes of practice and standards that we need to be addressing that concern the moral codes and beliefs and tolerance and everything else that's associated with this? And there's no one other than this panel that can answer these questions. So our panel of luminaries includes the amazing Caitlin Krause, who is, she teaches on the intersection of technology, innovation, and well-being at Stanford University.
Oh no.
Not again?
Just
you're
a
back.
little.
Back?
You're back.
Okay, sorry. All right, is so the business director of business and community development at the Virtual World Society and author of some amazing books. They're listed in the event description that you can find if you're in circle menu. Kent Bias here is a journalist, a futurist, podcaster, and host of Voices of VR. Any fans out there? Yes. Which features pioneering artists, storytellers, and technologists driving the resurgence of, which is fascinating, the word resurgence, of virtual and augmented reality. He's a philosopher, oral historian, and experiential journalist, helping to define the patterns of immersive storytelling, experimental design, and the ultimate potential of XR. We also have Brittan Heller, who's a lawyer and pioneer, and she was just recently here with Tom Furness with the Fireside Chats. She is a pioneer in leveraging innovations like AI, VR, AR, and XR to promote justice and fair treatment for all by examining the issues like combating cyber harassment, cyberbullying, bringing civil rights into digital environment. And she serves as Council at Foley Hug's corporate social responsibility practice. Did I say that right? Hogue. Hogue is the right pronunciation.
Holy Hoeg, which
Hoeg.
the worst mispronunciation has been Holy Hog, so you are
Holy
fine.
Hogue. Yeah. Well, I have
Holy
that
Hog.
name is in my family tree. You think I would get it right. Okay. And then appearing any moment magically up on the stage will be Tom Furness, the co-founder of Virtual World Society, considered the grandfather of VR. Hopefully you've attended some of the events that he's done here with the Universal Experience. And he did an Ask Me Anything event in Engage was it yesterday, the day before. It's all blurring together now. Really sharing the insights and lessons learned with over almost 60 years he's been working in virtual reality. He is a professor at the University of Washington's Human Interface Technology Lab that he built, and his focus is on virtual reality for good and education. Have I introduced everyone?
I believe you have. Yes.
Okay.
Wow.
Your turn. Caitlin, it's all yours.
All right. So I love that these topics sometimes they bear a certain weight, like you hear them and we might feel the gravity. And this conversation is meant to be like an unpanel, an unsession, just really sitting. The larger conceit of Univirtual was to gather your friends around for dinner style conversations about topics close to your heart. So when I was thinking about that and topics that are close to my heart, I thought about ethics and the word consideration. So we are going to approach with gravity for the topics, but I'd like to introduce maybe the levity of just bringing up anything that occurs to us in the moment, as if Tom Furness and Brittan Heller and Kent Bai and myself are around a table just sharing a meal. And maybe one of the questions might be, we can get to this later, but if you were having a conversation dinner about ethics, what would be on the menu, right? Like, are we talking 5-course meal, something super fancy?
Tacos.
Do we want to be casual? Yeah, tacos. Okay. So this is something that again, we all come at this topic and approach it from different lenses. So I wanted to just start by introducing the humanity underneath our stories and how we come to have a history approaching ethics. So I was going to ask both Kent and Brittan to share their lenses. My lens is 2 decades working in education. Now I'm teaching about digital well-being at Stanford, as Laurel mentioned, and I really look at ethics in terms of dignity and human rights, and also human experiences, whether they're mediated by any form of technology, really thinking about individuals and collective, and also baked into that aspects of mindfulness, compassion, some of these universal histories of how we approach a genuine connection to the experiences that we're having. So so I like to think about ethical and moral philosophy and how people approach things like their own identity, and whether they feel as if they're given a chance to be and express their authenticity when they're within an experience. And that's what draws me to VR and to immersive environments, just thinking of all the ways that they bring us in closer connection. So that's just a little bit of my history and my lens, and I would pass it over to Kent to describe some of the lenses that he uses when he's approaching a topic like this.
Yeah. So, thanks for that great introduction and setting the context. For me, as a sort of technology journalist, I'm in the process of both covering what's happening with the technology, but also really listening to the community. And I think this first came onto my lens back I've been covering VR now for about 7 years, going back to actually, tomorrow will be the 7-year anniversary for when I sort of first, did the first interviews on March 19th, 2014. But it was probably in 2016 when I started hearing from the community concerns around privacy as we move forward. So I think there's a fundamental dialectic in terms of, like, there's innovations that happen that the technology enables all these new amazing things, At the same time, there's these potential harms that could be done with the technology. And so how do you balance the positive benefits versus the harms that are being done? And I think that's the challenge with these ethical issues is that another lens that I look at is context and seeing how there's certain contexts in which that generally technology is blurring context and it's dissolving context. So as an example, you may be using VR technology, but someone on the other end, if they're recording all the data, they may be able to discern certain medical information about you, right? So we essentially have these like medical devices on, and what happens to that data? Should it be treated like protected through HIPAA laws, or is there some sort of fiduciary responsibility that should be introduced there? So looking at how generally, as we start to use these technologies, you can think about how there's all these different contexts and all of them are collapsing. And how do you navigate those sort of ethical dilemmas that happens when you have those context collapses? So yeah, and looking at the different contexts between culture, the laws, the economy, and then different ways in which that the technological architecture and the code is able to kind of mediate how do you address this issue? Is this an issue that needs to have new laws? Is this a new issue that needs technological architecture? Is this an issue that people are going to be bad and you can only mitigate things up to a certain point, but if people are going to be bad to each other, then there's maybe some limits in terms of what you can do. So, there's a wide range of different issues that we can dive into, but generally those are some of the lenses that I look at some of these issues through.
That's great. This is our warm up here to diving deeper.
Um, as for me, I tend to look both at domestic law, basically privacy law, international human rights law, criminal law, and also looking to international legal standards. My background is I used to prosecute genocide and war crimes for the International Criminal Court, the ICTR, and then for the U.S. government. And I had a special role in at the U.S. government where I was in the human rights section that became the CHIP, which is the computer hacking and IT specialist. So looking really at how human rights and technology really intersect. That's how I've approached it. And people in legal academia, which I won't say I dabble with it. I kind of flirt with it because I'm not really sure if I want to commit. We nobody's talking about issues related to immersive technology in this space yet. And so looking at the way that legal academia needs to addresses these issues, but looks at them in the abstract rather than in the manifest. And I think the other lens is also looking at things through the physical manifestation of online harms. I've done a lot of work with online harassment related cases for about 15 years. And to me, this just seems like another revolution of that wheel in a way that, since it implants in your amygdala like a memory, it's a whole new ballgame.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, speaking something Tom brings up quite often is that phrase, do no harm. And I'm thinking about the prime consideration, if there's anything that's, say, a guiding principle or something that you think is paramount at this point in terms of consideration. Tom has said many times, Tom Furness, that his is do no harm. Think about doing no harm. Sometimes that means stepping back a little bit and considering the implications of choices you make with ethics. I've been thinking about Asimov laws and some of the modernization of what maybe couldn't have been predicted at the time. Or yeah, so I think for myself, definitely the word dignity, and I know Brittan, we've talked before about agency, not just protection, but allowing a certain amount of agency to the individual for human rights. Those are some of my prime considerations when I approach the topic. Do you two have any that are like your go-to touchstones?
I look at the Ruggie principles, which is another name for um, the UN principles on business and human rights, because it really delineates the obligations of states, the obligations of companies, and the rights of the individual. And so a lot of people think that there's nothing out there that can really guide us on issues, but this is designed to help companies take responsibility, nations to protect their citizens, and citizens to understand their rights. So for me, that really really works in a way that other sort of kind of off the shelf codes may not, because it's consensus based and it is an internationally approved system.
Great. And how forward are those UN codes? Are they the Ruggie codes? Are they pretty much at the forefront? Do people make that known when they adopt those codes? Like how much do those come across the public channels?
More when when companies will do a human rights impact assessment, because that's kind of the rubric by which they are evaluated. So in that way, if they publicize the results, it is well known, but otherwise it kind of goes under the radar, even with practitioners of international law who aren't aware that there is guidance for the responsibility of states and companies and the obligations of individuals.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah.
Kent, how about you?
Well, I do think that the human rights approach that Brittan is sort of alluding to, I'm seeing more of that recently. And I think this is an area actually where there's a lot of discussion around what are those set of generalized principles that we should be looking to. I think part of the thing that happens with XR technologies, with virtual and augmented reality, is that you're essentially taking all these different contexts. And so like the medical context and, the context for education and context for gaming and entertainment, and you're kind of mashing all these together. And so there's all these existing frameworks that have been pretty separate. And in some ways you have to come up with some approach to say, what are all the different contexts and what is universal across all of VR now that we've got this devices that hack our perceptual input and, have access to all this intimate data. And so, the thing that I'd come back to, and when you said do no harm, I think that's the Hippocratic Oath and is generally the guiding principle in medical applications. But I think in some ways in technology ethics, there's a little bit of trade-offs where I don't know if any technology is going to be completely able to meet that standard of not bringing any harm to anybody. Just in terms of, just the simple aspects of diversity and inclusion versus getting something as accessible as you can, versus different ways of being the most immersive. There could be certain ways in which that you have to make these certain trade-offs between, do you make it the most accessible as you possibly can, which we all want, but then, you have different ways of kind of toggling things off and on, and having those choices, but then that introduces like cognitive load and choice and other things that people have to go through. So that will be bad user experience. And so there's certain ways in which that, in order to achieve, the more that I look at the ethical issues, the more that I see that there's some of these big domains that are in tension with each other. One example is, Facebook will say they want to be able to make the technology as cheap as possible to get it as accessible as possible. And so that for them, that gives them a moral argument to justify their kind of surveillance capitalism business models, because they're able to make the technology more affordable for people, but at what cost to our privacy? So it's like you're weighing two different things of like, what do you value more? And if you want to help bridge the digital divide, then to what degree are you willing to maybe surrender certain aspects of your privacy or agency in order to have this larger goal? And I feel like the more I dig into these, the more that I see that there's these existential trade-offs. Facebook has said they have their responsible innovation principles that help them guide those types of decisions, which they're very simple. There's other emerging technique. There's a whole movement called neuro rights, So trying to say there's a right to identity, right to agency, right to mental privacy, the right to be free from algorithmic bias, and the right to have fair access to technology. So those are the 5 kind of neuro rights principles. But there's a lot of other sort of human rights principles you could start to pull in. And I think that's part of, what this discussion that we're going to be having with EFF, and Brittan and I are going to be part of this kind of World Cafe at RightsCon, starting to brainstorm with the human rights community, asking, okay, what are those other generalized rights that maybe we could point to that we need to use as the underlying design principles?
Fascinating. And I just heard RightsCon is at the beginning of June. When you have those discussions, will they be live streamed out so that people can listen in on those conversations, or are they mostly private for people attending? You might not
I
even
think that
know.
I think they're mostly private for people
Mhm.
attending, but we can double check on that.
We don't know
Okay.
yet. I know that there's going to
Yeah.
be breakout rooms, and it's hard to do like
Yep.
recordings of Zoom calls of breakout rooms. So I imagine that
Yeah.
there'll be a significant part of whatever session that will maybe be sort of not recorded in that way. But generally,
Sure.
I think this is like wider discussions that are starting to happen within the industry.
Well, and it kind of leads me to thinking about, like, I've been following a lot of trends and, of course, conversations, whether they're here, whether they're on Clubhouse. It's like ethics comes up, and sometimes I think it comes up because people either bump into walls, or, technology is advancing, and then people are suddenly realizing, oh, that was not my original intention. So, unfortunately, I think some people bring things up because problems happen. And I was just curious about both of you doing kind of an analysis of the past 5 years, like where we're at as people who want to prioritize ethics in XR and VR. Do you feel like we're at a stage where we're ahead of a curve of advancement of technology to be able to establish some of these values and standards uh, before things get really big? Or do you think that we're in a process where it's part of, I don't know, maybe learning a new literacy of how to talk about
Yeah.
these issues and catch up in a sense? Yeah,
I
just curious. Mhm.
I think we're behind the curve. I
Okay.
tend to be Debbie Downer about all this.
That's okay.
That I think we're behind the curve because when I speak with companies or with state and federal regulatory agencies, they assume that this is just a new manifestation of social media and don't understand why the character of the data, the potential for interaction between the data sets, and the impact of automated decision making on something that has neurological impacts is different than Twitter, to be blunt. So I also think they haven't seen the type of harms yet that have been manifest through Twitter and Facebook and other forms of social media, and because of that, they don't feel provoked to do something yet. So it's more about putting out fires as they emerge, and they don't see the potential threat as being an opportunity. They just sort of see it as a chance to catch their breath.
Mhm.
Kent, would you
I see-
agree? Because I'm
Well,
I'm pretty
I see
negative.
there's a number of different tiers. Like as I said before, there's the technological architecture and the code, and then you have like the market dynamics, and then you have the law, and then you have the culture, right? And I feel like the culture and the technological architecture, there's been a lot of things like, say, harassment in VR has been one of the things that has been a lot of like, hey, maybe we need to do technological architecture for personal space bubbles and
Mhm.
allowing people to block people, and some of the basic needs that people have that have emerged from the culture. And then there've been some response that has come about based upon people's experience about how the culture can act really nasty within these new technologies and new technological architecture that needs to be put in. So I think there's a certain amount where some of the issues that, that certainly could predict what was going to happen, but also some stuff that you don't know is going to happen until it actually happens and you actually deploy the technology. I think the area that gives me the concern is more of the ones that the network effects once you start to have the VR as a platform at large scales, where
Mhm.
we already don't really know how the existing infrastructure of social media and networked effects of say fake news or disinformation campaigns that are able to bring about big shifts in collective culture and society when you have weaponized state actors who are weaponizing these networks to be able to serve their needs of communication or persuasion. So what does that look like when you
Gosh.
have experiential warfare? But I think the other bigger issue that I have concern that is some of the work that I know Brittan has been working at in terms of privacy and biometric psychography. It's all the ways in which that these technologies are giving a window into the most intimate aspects of our mental privacy. And while you fuse all these different things together, there's an existing paradigm of privacy that's all based upon identity. But we're moving into a time where they already know who you are based upon your username and everything else, and potentially even biometrics in the future to be able to identify you. But it's going to be to the point where they're able to see what you're looking at, your eye gaze, your biometrics, what you're feeling, your emotional sentiment analysis. They'll be aware of the virtual environment as well as potentially even like ego-centered data capture with AR, being aware of what you're looking at in your surrounding context, and to be able to extrapolate with all the massive amounts of biometric data what type of inferences they're going to be able to make on you in real time. And I think the existing models of surveillance capitalism ported into where we're going with XR technology start to get into like these Black Mirror-esque, kind of Big Brother scenarios where it's just, a massive amounts of information. So I think that's where I'd say we are behind in terms of when you try to like have innovation but also have protecting harms. We in the United States, at least, we definitely preference the innovation above and beyond some of the sort of trying to create systems that are going to prevent those harms. And there's responsible innovation techniques that are supposed to maybe allow you to kind of slowly introduce some of these different things and see how it goes and then maybe pull it back. And I don't see as much of the mechanisms of pulling things back when things go wrong. It's almost like let's throw it out there, move fast and break things is still the ethos that we see with all these technologies. And I feel like that's the thing that's more concerning because I don't see a lot of infrastructure in place to kind of change those dynamics, that preference innovation over the harms that are done.
Yeah, I would have to say I agree. And maybe that means all of us are, I like to say like realist, idealist. Like I do think Debbie Downer, it's like we can be both very, very critical, not cynical. Like I'm looking at things and just seeing different examples of, as Kent and Brittan were saying, this idea of either rapid prototyping or getting something out there to market and then testing it and then realizing, oh, that's what happened. I didn't necessarily intend that, but yet culturally, what I also noticed that concerns me about the last 5 years, maybe even a decade plus, is a difference in I guess it's human behavior, like the way that
Mm.
we interact with technology, whether it's wearables. Um, Sometimes we start to incorporate things as part of our lifestyle and part of our approach to, say, our own identity. The more the UI becomes really reflective and adopted and integrated in a way that we see as very let's say comfortable, for example, like trackers for athletics or um, some kind of device that we can wear quite easily. I've seen more people say to me originally, oh, that's really motivating, that gets me out there running, I can track my workouts. But last week students and I were talking about some of the psych studies about wearables or about incorporating any kind of bio-tracking devices. And it's really interesting what happens with, I'll have to talk with Brittan more about psychography because people over time sometimes start to have a feeling like they're always being tracked, something's always on, and then measuring that benefit, like that intrinsic benefit of an experience can sometimes be even more free and liberating when it goes unmonitored. So there is a new use case or new conditions where people are starting to say, I love sometimes just turning everything off and not having the tracking. And as soon as you get a certain level of motivation, you don't need the feedback. And how do I know what the weather's like? I go outside and feel it against my skin. Like how much can we use our own bodies as part of what gives us that integrated feedback? So a little bit of consideration here also about the way that we incorporate technology as part of our identity, and does it own our data? Or back to kind of something I think Jaron Lanier is a proponent of, us getting some kind of compensation when we give our data away, because it's an exchange, it's a currency, and we should feel like we have rights. And I think Kent, you brought up sometimes there is a signature page like, oh, I agree to this, but it's so long and so convoluted that people sometimes give away their rights just so they can be able to access the benefit of the technology. So yeah, so I'm thinking a lot about that.
For me, the base question that underlies it all goes back to consent.
Yeah.
And in the law, there's this concept of meaningful informed consent. So like Kent was saying, if you scroll down and down and down and down and finally say, yes, I just want to use your thing, I'm an attorney and I normally don't read all that boilerplate. What's interesting to me is how we are going to signal our consent in immersive environments to other people, in addition to how we are going to grant that consent to these platforms and experiences. I've also been kind of noodling on the idea that even in this community, I feel like we need to start differentiating some of the functionalities and the risks between AR and VR, because I feel like AR is much more omnipresent at this point, and you're going to get a lot more consumer adoption of it earlier, and people are starting to see the enterprise case and also the entertainment case through all the filters on Snap and the really fun art projects that are coming out, like the floating fruit cart in LA, which I love. But looking at these things, even though they're both immersive technologies, they're not the same. And if we treat them as the same, then the law will treat them as the same, then the government will treat them as the same, and they can do very, very different things and will expose us to different risk factors.
So do you
Yeah,
think that, oh,
Go ahead.
Kent,
Go ahead.
Kent, you could be speaking in flow. I was going to add in that notion of whether your identity is the same in these different environments. If the use cases are different, do we have different sort of constructions of Caitlin, Kent, and Brittan for each environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think both identity and privacy are very context dependent. So, who you are around your parents versus who you are around your workmates versus, your friends, you have different aspects of yourself that you can reveal different aspects that are context dependent. And I think just the same, the challenge of a lot of these immersive technologies is, like, just say the consent is also context dependent. Like, you may be willing to give medical information over when you're giving it to a doctor who's going to be giving you medical advice, but you may not want that same level of intimate data given over to Facebook to be able to, sell ads and do psychographic profiling. And so I think there's this challenge between the consent versus the opposite side, which is the granular control and permission fatigue, which is, everybody who's on a website now, you have to kind of give consent to the cookies. And then how much meaningful consent do you have whenever can you actually, opt out? And oftentimes you can't even, it's sort of like, but when we think about, to the degree to which that you're going to have so many different layers of, like, do you feel comfortable giving this random website or random application access to your eye gazing data, your hand tracking data, all the stuff that, you want to be able to have access to some feature that maybe it would be you'd actually benefit from having a better experience of that feature, but there's a compromise in terms of what information you're giving up. And then in aggregate, when you have 20 different checks boxes of, I know that iOS and iPhone has started to say these are different things that you have, but I think in XR, it's going to be even more And then like, what can you do with all that stuff is also then people having a mental model around what are the trade-offs between, oh, I want to have this cool. I mean, the most simple thing is like when you on your phone and maybe you don't want Google tracking where you are, so you try location tracking, but you open up your map and you're like, well, in order to use this feature, you need to turn it on, and it's like, okay, well, I'm going to turn it on to be able to use it for this application, then I'm going to turn it off. So think about that, but in XR with all the different layers of permissions of maybe you have a graceful degradation of something that doesn't work, but if you want it to work, then you'd have to turn it back on. So I think there's this existential trade-off between that control and consent versus to what degree do we want to make all those choices with permission fatigue and also just, checking all these boxes in order to get into the gate for some of these experiences.
Ken, I know you and I have talked about this, but I have a question for the audience. What do you think that the app that was the largest location tracking device, the most popular, profitable location tracking device that ever was, what is that app? First, we're going to ask that, and then we're going to ask who had it on their phone.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
First up is Daniel Dubosky Bryant from, sorry, let me get Daniel is up from Educators in VR. You're on.
Hi, where are you?
Hi, was it Google
Hi.
Maps? Hi
No.
there, great to see you. Was it Google Maps? No?
Oh,
No.
Okay.
Okay.
good
Yeah,
guess,
Not
though.
that was
Google
my
Maps.
guess.
Good guess. All right. Who else? Anybody else? Hit the raise hand button.
I don't know.
Okay, Captain Nell.
right.
I think it's Lundgren. Nell.
Is it Waze?
No. This is
Oh.
so I'll take one more guess and
Okay,
and
wait.
then,
There's two other people who have. Lita's
great.
up. Lita?
Find my phone.
Nope.
Nope. All right, Haley-Ann's up.
That's a good guess.
Well, I don't know if
I
it's
like
an
that
app,
one.
but I was going to say the actual basic cell phone mechanisms that track people, they always have since cell phones were invented. So please use them if you're really lost. And that's been available for 20 years, 20, 30 years. So since cell phones came in. But anyway,
Again, a very
really an
good
app.
guess. But the answer is Angry Birds.
Wow. Oh my
It was
goodness.
tracking. They were tracking your location.
That's their business model, is location-based tracking, which would then be
Really?
sold to advertisers. So
Wow.
you don't have to embarrass yourself by raising your hand to say like, oh yeah, I got Angry Birds. 'Cause
Wow.
I did that every day on the subway or on the metro in Washington D.C. to like spend the 10 minutes, and they knew exactly where I was, and then sent me targeted advertising. So it's this is what I mean about consent, right? You did I know that I was giving that away when I was playing the little bird thing? Not really, but in later years I thought, oh shit. So,
What do you two think about standardizing the consent languaging and then having, I mean, not that it's mandatory, but having more of the courses that are, say, part of our education system be about these topics so that people don't just approach them when things go wrong, but feel like, okay, oh, this is part of what a new curriculum is for learning.
I'd be more towards simplifying the language rather than standardizing it. Because if you standardize it, you have such a wide swath it has to cover. But really making sure that it, in plain language, says this is tracking information about 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is how we plan to use it. That to me would be an improvement. And I've started to see that a little bit. Ken, I don't know if you've started to see more of that, but
Well, it's I have a couple of thoughts. One thought is that I know the IEEE is a number of initiatives of, say, making machine readable permissions. So imagine when you go to a website, instead of having to click the box for every single time, every website you go, whether or not you give consent to cookies, if you were to basically say, I by default don't want anybody to be tracking these things, and you just like set some setting, and then it just is able to read that. I think that could be a model, especially when you start to look at like different VR applications where maybe by default you'd have certain settings, but then you have certain permissions or exceptions that you may have with certain applications that again, like that same model of thinking about when you open up Google Maps, when you have the location base turn off and it says, well, this won't really work until you turn this on. So, and then you decide to go ahead and turn that on. And then I guess I had another thought around just generally, but it's escaped me for the moment. So maybe we'll move on and come back.
Well, I feel like in the flow of this, I mean, we're getting very granular about the use cases of, oh, when would I agree to something? And I wanted to also add in a layer of complexity with our human emotion, because I was asking about, would Brittan be the same Brittan using AR versus VR immersive? And again, one of my big concerns is about people's emotional experiences. That scene is really important. I know Tom and I have talked about that many times, and Tom Furness is in the room right now. Just to let you know, over there, feel free to come over, chime in, Tom. But I'm really questioning right now how we promote the idea that avatars are humans and that every right, whether it's a different type of case, but it's still humans using the technologies. So wondering if you have thoughts about emotional design and ethics and really protecting that humanity. In my mind, it goes deeper than, say, putting up bubbles and blockers and things like that. Cooperation literacy. I think about Howard Rheingold and all of those uh, collective standards for how we should, maybe I should simplify them, but how we operate as societies, really, from the ground up, human first. How do we support that type of user engagement where people understand that feelings and emotions are part of these worlds?
I have a quick thought, which is that when I was part of the brainstorming session for this RightsCon panel, there was one of the experts from 19 article. She was talking about how they focus on a lot of the aspects of free speech and how when you have immersive technologies that are in kind of reading all of your emotions, reading all of different aspects of what's happening inside of your mind, that there's a number of different rights in terms of the right to mental privacy, the right to identity, the right to agency, where if you have technologies that are encroaching on those rights, then if they are able to understand what you're thinking and they're basically able to kind of extrapolate that algorithmically, and that may be taking away your right to free speech because you have a right to articulate something or not articulate something. So there's a way that you are choosing to what to disclose and what not to disclose, and how you particularly express that moment to moment given the larger context. And if you have technology that is able to, like Brittan has done this work on the biometric psychography, when you fuse all these things together, then that has a challenge to those underlying rights to mental privacy, the right to identity, and the right to agency. And I think that's, to me, one of the most existential challenges of like, how do we preserve these rights when there's all these other pressures that are moving us to have the technology to not only detect it, but to use it and for inferences and to feed it into all these other algorithms that are maybe there's a lack of a fiduciary relationship between how that data are used.
Yeah. For me, one of the next things that I'm going to be working on is accessibility related issues in this technology and how that interacts with human rights. And one of the things that I'm still noodling on, so if anyone here would like to talk about this more, I'm very, very happy to do that, is looking at communities like the deaf community in the United States, who've really built an identity around. There's deaf culture, there's different accents and sign language and things. And if we were to use our technology to I'm going to say fix in quotes, to fix people and help them eradicate physical disabilities, what impact does that have on these community identities and on volition and choice and human dignity? It's something I've been thinking about a lot. I went to the immersive Van Gogh exhibit in San Francisco right after I got vaccinated, and noticed that in every one of his self-portraits, his eyes are a different color. So I did more research on Van Gogh, and people think that he might have been colorblind. He was epileptic, and so he was treated with lead-based medicine, and one of the side effects of that is seeing coronas and auroras around lights, and that explains Starry Night. And so I want to make sure that if we are using AR and VR in order to help people with sensory perception, we're not accidentally going to counteract Van Gogh. And the answer that I've come with so far, the very preliminary one, is that it should be dial up and dial down and give people a consent-based model for this. So turn disability into a capability and almost like a superpower, because then they can see things in more than one way. But I think it gets very complicated when you're thinking about the medical potential of this technology, but how that interacts with how people conceive of who they are and what's important to them.
That's such a beautiful statement, and I love the metaphor. I love poetry too, and I was reading 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by Wallace Stevens. And, there are 13 ways of seeing and looking at something and expressing. I feel like sometimes everything that attempts to translate loses something in the translation. So what you said, Brittan, just struck me deeply, that each person has also that author of authority, their right to author their own experience and to not just automatically have anything from eye gaze tracking to something else. It might seem liberating, but it's also maybe our lens of looking at it and not theirs.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
very
and
important.
I'm gonna bug Kent about this later, because I'm trying to figure out where you draw the line. Yeah. Because you posted this video a couple weeks ago about the haptic suit that through electrical pulses was able to counter out somebody's Parkinson's tremors and allow them to walk and hold a pen. And that seems like magic to me, right? And so what is the role of choice and volition, and kind of like where is the crosscut across Maslow's pyramid, right?
Yeah, I mean, it gets into these very quickly philosophical discussions around fate and free will. Like,
Yeah.
to what degree are we going to be fated by the simulations that we're in, and to what degree do we have control over that? And there's already a limit. There's some balance between those things already. And I think as we move into people creating worlds, then there's yet another layers of that. How much control and agency do they have over their experiences? And to what degree do we have this kind of solipsistic reality, where this already happens in VR chat, where there's a lot of times where there may be local fish and they're swimming around. And I was in a new aquarium by Finn's. It was called Aquarius, and someone said, "Oh, hey, look, there's a whale shark," and I was like, "Oh, I don't see it." And they're like, "Oh, well, all the fish here are local." And so you have these experiences where we're in a shared reality, but yet at the same time, everybody's sort of seeing different permutations. And so, to what degree is that going to create communication mishaps, or different? There's all these new kind of social dynamics that are emerging, and I think the ethical implications start to come in terms of like, okay, well, who has access to these things? Is there disparities? And just, do you have the ability to kind of navigate the nuances for all these different things of being able to turn off this or that setting? And so there's sort of a digital divide that we already have, in that there's a certain fluency that people that are using the technologies are building up over time. And so how do we, I think with any distribution of technology, you have to think about how does that disperse out into the wider culture. There's always going to be the innovators and pioneers that are kind of helping lead the way, but then how do you make sure that those insights, innovations are kind of distributed more equitably over time? So yeah, I think there's a lot of the different issues. And in terms of the hard line, the thresholds, I think you know, I I did an interview with somebody about the biometric data, and he was a behavior neuroscientist, and he said there's an unknown ethical threshold between prediction and predicting behavior and controlling behavior, manipulating behavior.
Mhm.
So what's the line between prediction and manipulation? And from the differences between the behavioral neuroscience between, say, like advertising and just understanding persuasion versus like mind controller and being able to shift people's behaviors in a way that is, you know, kind of unethical. So when I talked to different philosophers and I asked, well, where is this sort of clear ethical line? And their answer was like, there is no clear ethical line. That's why we still have these ethical debates, is because there's these mutually exclusive trade-offs that you have to make across these different contexts. The whole issue with ethics is what's the framework for you to be able to make those trade-offs? To not only understand what those trade-offs are, but then as you're making design decisions, how do you weigh one area versus the next? Because there's always these dialectics where you, like, I did the XR ethics manifesto, right? And one of my insights from that was that, okay, would it be possible to live into the ultimate, you know, extreme to every single one of these dimensions? And I realized, no, it's not. It's like it would take, first of all, infinite time and money, but even if you
Time,
had
yeah.
that, you couldn't do it because there's certain ways in which that some of those aspects are conflicting with each other and they're mutually exclusive, and you have to make a decision as to what you're going to prioritize. And I think that's the challenge, is like not only getting an understanding of what that landscape is, but then what's the design and decision making framework that you have to allow you to navigate how do you make those decisions. And I think that's the essence of XR ethics. And you know, it will never be solved. There will always be new ethical dilemmas. There will always be new episodes of Black Mirror. There will always be ways in which that this could go horribly wrong. And it's, you know, trying to figure out how to mitigate those harms while, you know, not artificially holding back all the potentials for how you can use this technology for good.
So I think that's a constellation in my mind. We're all then our little, you know, we're united, kind of linked through the constellation that I'm forming in my own mind map. And I'm questioning, as kind of a closure here, do you think that governance, I mean, is there a universal governance invitation right now for people to seek, like beyond countries, beyond borders, some kind of way to defend these rights? Do you see these individuals, you know, us being faced with choices where we're isolated, or what's the hope for some kind of um, body to be defending this?
I I think one of the I think we need to start with baby steps. And so one of the things that I would like would be to for all of us to hear and amplify more voices from the global south and from other areas that are going to be impacted by this technology, but there may not have been mass adoption yet, because I I really don't want to see another sort of techno-colonialism type situation, um,
Mhm.
as this spreads throughout the world. Um, right now, I think, and Kent and I have had debates about this, about like, will an omnibus privacy bill cover this? Will it be sufficient? Will it be necessary? Um, I gave a presentation to the FTC about immersive technology, and based on their type of questions and reactions, I think we really are at square one.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah.
It's a beautiful
Yeah.
place to be, I guess, you know, because you
It
do have
is.
choices. And
It
I
is.
think the
Well,
Virtual World
you,
Society, looking over at Tom there, we've started an alliance for good where
Mm.
we'll be aligning people with more of the stories and more of the support, and, you know, people who want to really come together and say, well, what does this look like, not just from a regulatory standpoint, but what are the values that we want to see um, in what we're adopting and what we're using, and just make the conversation a little more dynamic to start. But Kent, were
well,
you going to add something there?
yeah, I was
Yeah.
just going to say that Thomas Metzinger is a philosopher, and he looks at philosophy of technology issues. One of the things he says is this technology pacing gap, which is that the pace of technological innovation is far outpacing the ways for us to have the conceptual frameworks and the policy frameworks to be able to handle it. And I'm a fan of Lawrence Lessig's what he calls the pathetic dot theory, but I also kind of think of it as a kind of a set of nested contexts where at the broadest context, you have the culture. And that's, educating people, and that's, people using technology in more of a peer-to-peer dimension in terms of ways in which that you educate people in terms of the different risks and harms, and just also as people interact with each other. There's only so far that you can sort of technologically mediate people as they interact.
Right.
And then you have the laws, which are both the laws of the, I'd say the codes of conduct and from each of the different applications that they're setting forth, but also the state and federal and international laws and human rights sort of laws that you have that are trying to dictate some of these different things. And I think that's where maybe the issues of privacy that we'll have to start to address some of these will only have to be at the legal layer, because the next layer is the economic and the market dynamics. And so the companies are going to do what they're going to do, and they're going to use their existing business model within the context of those laws. And so you have to set those laws in order to dictate how those companies interact. And then I'd say the base layer is the technological architecture and the code. So these are technologically mediated ways that you can start to shift the conversation. So if you want to talk about homeomorphic encryption as a approach to privacy, where there's certain ways of hiding the raw data from you may be able to do processing on it, but you don't have access to the raw data, or differential privacy, or federated learning, or all these different kind of algorithmic and architectural layers of how to address some of these different issues. But it's at kind of the base layer of the operating system or the hardware itself, or even the application design as we're designing as experiential designers. So I like to see that as we have these issues, there's ethical implications for how we can design ethically aligned technologies at each of those layers, whether it's the culture and keeping people informed, and the laws that we set. And there's a lot of discussion about what kind of tech policy we need to be able to create safeguards for people. And then there's the market dynamics. And so are there ways in which that there's decentralized approach, open source approach, or things that are not being driven by there can be competition, market competition. So if people have privacy protecting technologies and they end up having a market success, then that could be another way to kind of shift the overall discussion. And then the final one is the underlying technological architectures that we're building these things. So for me, that's, I think, the different layers in which that we can start to talk about some of these issues and the different trade-offs that we have at each of those layers.
Well, I like the nested frameworks. I'm always thinking in a visual way about these nestings to the adoption of people really understanding and feeling, okay, I can approach from this angle. I can see those nested frameworks and actually play a part in speaking about what's important at different stages. So I would say for me, what's been really clear in this dinner conversation is we are probably having a buffet of different pieces that are each appetizers, because we've talked a little bit about the tech design, gosh, the emotion, different applications, number one considerations. And I feel animated and as if I could come back for seconds. And you two just being part of this, it felt like an hour flies by. Yeah, I'm so grateful, and also grateful that you're out in the world, really investigating and continuing to learn and making your learning visible for others, by sharing it. So we have a lot of links that have been on the channel to both Brittan Heller, her papers and writings and postings, and also Kent's site and Voices of VR and all of their bios and more. I feel like this discussion clearly is going to continue. And representing Virtual World Society and Tom Furness, who is stage right over here, we're definitely going to share more about the Alliance for Good in the coming weeks, and more of the research that I'm doing and we're doing together to bring this to life also with the society. So I personally want to thank Laurel Van Fossen for being our introducer. Thank you so much to Educators in VR, and also to Virtual World Society for making Univirtual possible as a month-long extravaganza of experiences. Thanks to all the partners and sponsors who have been part of this. And just many thanks to all of the team involved. And Laurel, if there are any other closing remarks, we can certainly take. I'm going to hang around in case there are questions from people in the audience. And I'm going to pass it over to Keely. Thanks so much for today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. I just want to show emojis and thank you. Awesome panel. Thank you. So, this has been another Univirtual Experience Conference with the Virtual World Society and Educators in VR, bringing together experts and innovators in immersive education, disrupting education around the world. Thank you to Caitlin, Kent, Brittan, Tom, Furness for sharing their insights and passions with us all today. Thank you also to our sponsors who make this all possible and help us keep this event free and open to the public. Thank you to HP Virtual Reality and HP Higher Education, our Infinity sponsors. We'd also like to thank our Galaxy sponsors, Engage VR, Advances Education, also Changing Education in VR, and XR.
Let's do a dance
Also,
for all our
let's thank
sponsors.
Exactly.
and also thank Donna McTaggart of Let's Meet in VR, the event manager and director for Educators in VR and the Universal Experience. So with that, the event has finished, and you can stick around for a few minutes to ask a few questions. But for now, the live stream will now close. Thank you for all the filmers and volunteers today. Thank you very much, Fox, and thanks, moderators. Woohoo! Emojis for everybody.
It's the